There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself with fire or fury. It does not arrive wearing horns or carrying a blade in the open daylight. The most dangerous evil in human history has always arrived quietly, wearing a smile and offering a warm bed. It has always hidden itself behind polished wood floors and clean linen, behind generous meals and a lantern burning in the window to guide the weary traveler in from the cold. In the autumn of 1892, in a fog-drenched corner of rural Pennsylvania that most Americans had never heard of, a hotel stood at the end of a 2-mile road lined with ancient oaks. It had been operating for 25 years. It had appeared in no major newspaper. It had generated no scandals that anyone spoke about publicly. Guests arrived by train, walked the misty road, signed the leather ledger at the front desk, ate a warm dinner, slept in a clean room, and were never seen again. Not one, not two, dozens, then more than 100, then 200 souls swallowed by a building that looked like any other establishment of the era, complete with brass fixtures, expensive wallpaper, and the hospitable smile of its proprietors, a couple named Adelaide and Josiah Blackwood. For 25 years, no one was prosecuted. For 25 years, families wrote letters that received no replies, filed reports with sheriffs who filed nothing in return, and slowly, painfully learned to stop asking. Because in 1892, a person could disappear in America without the earth shaking even slightly. A traveling salesman without close family, a school teacher heading west for a new position, a businessman passing through Pennsylvania on his way to Chicago. These were people who existed in the gaps between communities, in the negative space of society, and the Blackwood Hotel had been designed with surgical precision to collect them. This is their story. This is the story of how a quiet building on a quiet road became one of the most systematic human trafficking operations in American history. And this is the story of the two people who finally tore it apart from the inside out. Welcome to Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives. The locomotive that pulled into Millbrook Station on the afternoon of October 4th, 1892 was 47 minutes behind schedule, which was not unusual for that particular stretch of rural Pennsylvania. The tracks through that region were poorly maintained, the grades unpredictable, and the fog that rolled in off the surrounding hills during October had a way of making engineers cautious in ways that timetables could not account for. The station itself was a modest affair, a single platform of weathered timber, a small waiting room with a potbelly stove that was never quite warm enough, and a station master who had occupied his post for nearly 2 decades. His name was Everett Crane, and he had learned long ago to perform a specific kind of blindness. He could look directly at a passenger stepping off a train and see them perfectly clearly, note their luggage, their approximate age, their manner of dress, and simultaneously file away nothing at all. It was a skill. Like any skill, it had been developed through practice. And like any skill developed through the practice of something wrong, it had left marks on him that no amount of subsequent remorse would ever fully erase. On that October afternoon, among the handful of passengers who descended onto the Millbrook platform, 2 would matter more than any others. Clara Whitmore was 28 years old, and she had been described by people who knew her in Boston as quietly formidable. That description was accurate. She was a woman who had navigated the world largely without assistance, who had managed a household and a modest income since the deaths of both her parents 7 years earlier, and who had done all of this with the kind of composed self-possession that society found easier to respect in men than in women. She was not large. She was not loud, but there was something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that this was not a woman who accepted being managed. She had come to Pennsylvania because her brother Thomas had vanished 3 months earlier. Thomas Whitmore had been 24 years old and employed as a commercial representative for a textile firm in Boston, a position that required him to travel regularly through the northeastern states soliciting contracts. He was, by all accounts, conscientious to the point of obsession. He wrote to Clara every week without exception. He had done so since their parents died, understanding that she worried, understanding that his letters were a kind of lifeline she relied upon even when she pretended otherwise. He had written to her from every city, every town, every stop along every route he had ever traveled. His last letter had been posted from Millbrook, Pennsylvania, dated July 16, 1892. It mentioned his stay at a respectable establishment called the Blackwood Hotel. It mentioned that the fog here was unlike anything he had seen, and that the surrounding landscape had a quality he could only describe as watchful, as though the trees themselves were paying attention. He mentioned that the proprietors were pleasant, the food excellent, and that he felt a mild but persistent unease he attributed to the weather and his own road weariness. The exact phrase he used was that the place felt carefully arranged, like a stage set waiting for something to happen. After that letter, silence. 3 months of silence, 3 months of letters sent into void, 3 months of increasingly urgent telegrams to the Millbrook Sheriff's Office, which produced responses of such dismissive inadequacy that Clara had finally packed a travel bag, withdrawn most of what remained in her savings account, and boarded a train west. The local sheriff had written in his last correspondence that travelers come and go, Miss Whitmore, and that young men can be forgetful about keeping in touch with family. She had read that letter 4 times. Each time she read it, something inside her went colder and more certain. The sheriff was not simply negligent. The sheriff was not writing to her. He was reading from a script. 50 feet down the platform, adjusting the strap of a worn leather satchel with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to moving quickly, stood Daniel Pierce. Daniel was 34 years old and had been a journalist for 11 years, the last 7 of them at the Philadelphia Register, where his investigative pieces had made him simultaneously one of the paper's most valuable assets and its most persistent headache. He had written about corrupt land grants in the Western Territories. He had exposed a network of fraudulent insurance schemes operating out of 3 eastern cities. He had once spent 2 weeks in a Baltimore holding cell rather than reveal a source, and his editor Garrett had told him at the time that his stubbornness would either make him famous or get him killed. Daniel had arrived at his current story the way he arrived at most stories, through a collection of small details that individually meant nothing and collectively suggested something monstrous. 18 months earlier, he had been researching a completely unrelated piece on railroad expansion through rural Pennsylvania when a courthouse clerk in Philadelphia mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her cousin had vanished somewhere in that region 3 years prior while traveling on business. Daniel had noted it. A few weeks later, reading through archived death notices, he found a brief entry about a family in New Jersey who had placed a missing persons notice for a traveling salesman who had last been traced to a small town in the same general area of Pennsylvania. The notice was 2 years old. There had been no resolution. He started pulling threads. Over the following year, Daniel had identified 7 individuals: businessmen, traveling salesmen, a schoolteacher named Catherine Mills, and a retired physician named Edmund Carver, all of whom had disappeared within a 90-mile radius of rural central Pennsylvania. All had last been confirmed as heading toward or through the same region. None had been found. None of the cases had received serious investigation. The local newspapers, where they existed, had offered brief notices suggesting the individuals had simply moved on, relocated without notice, continued their journeys westward into the vast American interior where people disappeared by choice every day. But families had been left behind, and families Daniel had found did not believe the official stories. They just no longer had anywhere to bring their disbelief. His editor had reviewed the evidence and told Daniel he was building a case out of coincidence and personal intuition, and that perhaps a week of rest might give him better perspective. Daniel had thanked him politely and booked a train to Millbrook on his own expenses. These were the 2 people who stepped onto that October platform in the thickening Pennsylvania fog. They did not know each other. They did not speak immediately, but they were both heading to the same place, and they were both carrying the same dangerous quality: the absolute refusal to look away. Everett Crane, the station master, watched them both with his practiced hollow gaze and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid, not of them, not precisely. He felt the particular fear of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has just seen the first sign that the carrying might be about to end. He directed them to the Blackwood Hotel with his standard words, 2 miles north, can't miss it. And as he watched them walk away into the fog, he turned back to his station and stood very still for a long moment, looking at nothing. The road to the Blackwood Hotel was the kind of road that seemed designed to discourage second thoughts. The oaks that lined it were old enough that their roots had heaved sections of the dirt track into uneven ridges, and their canopy overhead was dense enough in October, even after most leaves had fallen, to reduce the already fading afternoon light to something closer to dusk. The fog moved between the trees in slow, deliberate patterns, and the sound of the surrounding countryside, the wind, the distant birds, seemed to arrive muffled and strange, as though the landscape was making an effort to muffle itself. Clara walked on the right side of the road and noticed everything. She had developed, over the months of searching for Thomas, the habit of treating every new environment as a source of potential information. She noticed the absence of farmhouses along this stretch of road. She noticed that the mud bore the tracks of carriage wheels but very few foot traffic marks, suggesting that local residents rarely traveled this particular route on foot. She noticed, in a gap between the trees, a glimpse of dark water, a creek or pond, its surface absolutely still despite the breeze moving through the branches above it. Daniel walked on the left side of the road and also noticed everything. He noticed the same absence of farmhouses. He noticed that the carriage tracks were frequent enough to suggest regular traffic to the hotel, but that there were no departing tracks of loaded wagons, which a hotel legitimately supplying itself with food and goods would have produced in abundance. He noticed that the road showed no evidence of the foot traffic a genuinely busy hotel would generate from guests taking walks or exploring the surroundings. They were strangers who had not yet spoken, but they were reading the same text. Clara broke the silence first, because she was not naturally inclined toward patience when patience served no purpose. "Are you traveling on business, sir?" Daniel considered the question and the woman asking it. There was nothing casual about her inquiry. She was assessing him, which suggested she had a reason to be cautious. In a manner of speaking, he said, "Daniel Pierce from Philadelphia. I work as a journalist. I'm researching certain patterns of disappearances in this region." There was a half-beat pause during which Clara processed this, and Daniel watched her process it, and something shifted in the air between them. "Clara Whitmore from Boston," she said. "My brother disappeared near here in July. His things were last confirmed at a hotel called the Blackwood." Daniel stopped walking. She stopped 2 paces ahead of him, then turned back. "Thomas Whitmore," he said quietly. Her expression did not crack, but something changed behind her eyes. "You know his name?" "It's in my notes," Daniel said carefully. "He was the 8th case I identified. I've been building a file for over a year." "There are more," Clara said. It was not a question. "At least 7 others that I've confirmed, possibly many more." They stood in the fog-heavy road and looked at each other, 2 strangers who had just discovered they were standing at the entrance to the same dark room. Then, without discussing it further, they began walking again, this time closer together, as though proximity was the only reasonable response to what they both understood they were walking toward. The Blackwood Hotel materialized through the fog the way certain inevitable things materialize, gradually and then all at once, taking shape from indistinct mass into specific terrible architecture. It was a large structure for its setting, 3 stories of dark-stained timber with a steeply pitched roof and a wraparound porch whose boards were maintained with a care that seemed incongruous with the remoteness of the location. Warm light burned in every ground-floor window, and smoke curled from 3 separate chimneys, and the scene had, on the surface, the quality of a painting meant to evoke comfort and safety. Clara's first impression was that it was too much, too warm, too perfect, too deliberately welcoming in a way that reminded her of Thomas's phrase, carefully arranged, like a stage set. The front door opened before either of them knocked. Adelaide Blackwood was 52 years old, and had spent the better part of 3 decades cultivating an appearance of irreproachable gentility. She was tall, precisely dressed in black silk that had been expensive when it was made and had been maintained with obsessive care since then. Her steel-grey hair was arranged with architectural severity. Her smile was technically flawless. It engaged every muscle it was supposed to engage and produced every visual signal associated with genuine warmth, and it felt, to Clara, like watching a machine operate. "Good evening," Adelaide said, her voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who had given this greeting hundreds of times and refined it down to something approaching art. "I am Mrs. Adelaide Blackwood. You must be exhausted from your journey. Please come in from this dreadful fog." The interior of the hotel was genuinely impressive, which Clara recognized as its most dangerous quality. The lobby featured floors of polished hardwood that reflected the lamplight in warm golden pools. The wallpaper was deep burgundy with a subtle floral pattern. The brass fixtures were immaculately maintained. A grand staircase curved upward along the right wall, its banister carved with a level of detail that suggested a craftsman who had been given both time and money. The furniture was heavy, well-made, expensive. But 3 things were wrong. The first was the smell, not an unpleasant smell exactly, more of an absence layered beneath the more obvious sense of polished wood and food preparation. Something faintly chemical, barely detectable, like the ghost of something that should not have been present in a hotel lobby. The second was the silence. A building this size with guest rooms on 3 floors and what appeared to be an active kitchen should have produced constant ambient sound. Footsteps above, conversation filtering through walls, the creak of floorboards as people moved through their evening routines. The Blackwood Hotel was almost completely silent. The silence was not peaceful, it was managed. The third was the wall of photographs. Dozens of framed images documenting the hotel's history, its exterior in various seasons, its dining room laid for formal meals, the surrounding landscape in different weather. Not a single image contained a guest. Not a single image showed a human face beyond the Blackwoods themselves, appearing in 3 formal portraits at intervals across the wall. A hotel decorated with photographs of itself, containing no evidence that any of the people who passed through it had ever truly existed there. Josiah Blackwood emerged from behind the front desk with the energy of a man who had decided that performing contentment loudly enough could substitute for genuine feeling. He was heavyset and flushed, with thinning hair and small eyes that were too bright and moved too fast for someone who was merely happy to have guests. "New arrivals," he announced, as though this were an event requiring announcement. "Splendid. We pride ourselves on hospitality here at the Blackwood. Absolute discretion and comfort. That is our promise to every guest who walks through our door." Absolute discretion and comfort. Clara filed the phrasing. Hotels promised comfort as a matter of course. They did not typically lead with discretion. She approached the desk directly. "I'm inquiring about my brother, Thomas Whitmore. He stayed here in July." The response was so smooth it had clearly been rehearsed. Adelaide moved to the leather ledger and turned pages with theatrical deliberateness. "Whitmore, yes, room 207. He stayed 3 nights, checked out on the 19th. A pleasant gentleman. He mentioned he was continuing west." "Did he leave a forwarding address?" "I'm afraid not." Adelaide's smile did not alter by a fraction. "Guests come and go, dear. We respect their privacy and don't pry into their plans." Daniel stepped forward and assumed the persona he had learned to deploy in situations like this. The persona of the professionally affable, mildly dense journalist who was interested in everything and threatening to no one. "I'd be very grateful for a room for the week," he said warmly. "I'm working on a series of travel articles about rural Pennsylvania hospitality. I've heard wonderful things about this establishment, and I was hoping to interview longtime staff and perhaps review your guest records as part of my research into the region's tourism patterns." The warmth in Josiah's face underwent a slight but perceptible modulation. "We value our guests' privacy above all else, Mr. Pierce. Our records are held in the strictest confidence. It is precisely this discretion that has built our reputation over 25 years." The warning was polite, it was also unmistakable. They were assigned rooms with an efficiency that felt preconsidered. Clara to room 203 on the second floor, Daniel to room 218, separated from her by the width of the building. The arrangement was noted by both of them independently, and by neither of them commented upon in the moment. A young man appeared to carry their luggage. He was perhaps 20 years old, pale and thin in the way of someone who has been inadequately fed for some time, with eyes that moved in the careful pattern of someone who had learned to see without appearing to look. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a person performing a task they have performed so many times it no longer requires thought. He did not speak. He did not make eye contact. When Clara attempted to press a small gratuity into his hand, his entire body flinched, as though she had moved to strike him. "That is Michael," Adelaide offered, appearing at Clara's shoulder with the quality of someone who had been listening for precisely this moment. "A good worker, simple-minded, I'm afraid, doesn't speak. We employ him as an act of Christian charity." Michael disappeared down the corridor without looking back. Clara watched him go and thought about the flinch. A person startled by an unexpected touch flinches differently than a person who has been conditioned to expect that contact means pain. Their rooms were clean and well appointed, and locked with mechanisms that seemed, upon examination, somewhat more substantial than the average hotel room required. The window latches were the kind used on buildings where windows are not expected to be opened from the inside. The furniture was heavy enough that rearranging it would be a significant undertaking. And the wardrobe, Clara noticed when she opened it to hang her traveling coat, was considerably deeper than the room's dimensions suggested it ought to be. She rapped on the back panel of the wardrobe with one knuckle. The sound that came back was hollow. The dining room that evening was set for 20. 2 guests occupied it, Clara and Daniel, plus the silent elderly couple who sat at the far end of the room and ate without looking up or speaking or giving any indication that they were aware of being in the company of other human beings. Their existence had the quality of furniture, present but not really there. The meal was extraordinary, which was, in its own way, another detail that did not fit. Roasted chicken prepared with herbs that suggested either a skilled kitchen staff or a cook with genuine talent, fresh bread, vegetables that had clearly been obtained recently, a warm apple dessert that would have received compliments in a fine Philadelphia restaurant. It was the quality of food you served to people you were trying to impress, or to people you were trying to keep docile and content. Adelaide presided over the meal from a small desk near the kitchen entrance, and Josiah moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the restless energy of a man who was performing business rather than actually busy. Their combined surveillance of the room was total. There was not a moment during the meal when at least one of them was not watching. Clara ate carefully and noted, without allowing herself to dwell on the implications, that her water tasted very slightly of something she could not identify. Not unpleasant, barely detectable. She left most of it and asked for more and watched to see whether the replacement was poured from the same pitcher. It was. Daniel, sitting across the room, was watching Adelaide. Specifically, he was watching where Adelaide's attention kept returning between her observations of the guests. There was a door beneath the main staircase, a door that, unlike every other door in the visible section of the hotel, featured 3 separate locks. Adelaide's gaze returned to it 4 times during the meal, not with worry exactly, with the proprietary attention of someone checking on something valuable. After dinner, in the dim corridor outside their rooms, Clara and Daniel exchanged fewer than 30 words and managed to communicate everything essential. "Something is wrong here. I know your room, midnight." In her room, Clara waited until the hotel had settled into its managed silence, then returned to the wardrobe. She pressed along the edges of the back panel systematically, and in the lower right corner, beneath her hanging coat, she found the mechanism. A slight give, a pressure point, and the panel swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently enough that they made no sound. The passage beyond was barely 3 feet wide, with a ceiling just high enough to allow a person of average height to walk slightly hunched. The walls were rough-cut timber, and every few feet small apertures had been worked into the wood at eye level, cleverly concealed on the room's side by decorative elements, the back of a picture frame, the carved detail of a door molding, a knothole that appeared natural and was not. She brought her face close to one and looked through into the room across the corridor, a room that appeared, from what she could see, to be occupied by a man sleeping very heavily, far more heavily than the hour suggested. The wardrobe wall of the Blackwood Hotel was, she understood, a surveillance apparatus. The building had been constructed with these passages built into it, not added later, not improvised. This had been designed from the beginning as a place where guests could be watched at every hour without their knowledge. The implication of this was not subtle, and she did not allow herself to soften it. When Daniel tapped on her door at midnight, she brought him directly to the wardrobe and showed him the passage. In the lamplight, she watched his face process it, watched the journalist in him catalogue it and the human being in him react to it, and both reactions were instructive. They sat at a writing desk and laid out what they had each observed: the chemical smell in the lobby and the barely detectable taste in the water, the excessive locks throughout the building, the way Michael had flinched, the absence of evidence that guests ever truly occupied this space in any personal way, the fact that the hotel, large enough to house 30 guests comfortably, appeared to contain almost none, the 3 separate locks on the door beneath the staircase, Adelaide's surveillance of that door throughout dinner. Daniel spread his notes on the desk. 7 confirmed disappearances before your brother, he said quietly, all of them last traced to Millbrook, all of them described by local newspapers as having simply moved on, all of them leaving behind families, belongings, professional commitments that people who simply moved on do not leave behind. Thomas's letter, Clara said. He described feeling uneasy but not being able to explain why. He called it carefully arranged. Both of them looked at the walls of the room around them without looking at the walls of the room around them. The word hung between them. A floorboard in the corridor creaked. They sat completely motionless, watching the thin line of yellow light beneath the door. A shadow passed, paused for a count of 5, then moved on. They waited in silence for another 10 minutes before speaking again, and when they did, it was in whispers that barely disturbed the air. Tonight we observe, Daniel said. Tomorrow we investigate properly. I need to access that office under the stairs. You need to see what's in those outbuildings. Before they separated, Clara described what she had seen from her window the previous night. Josiah crossing the yard after 11 in the evening, carrying a lantern and something else she had not been able to identify clearly, and entering the windowless structure at the far end of the property. His light visible through the walls for 20 minutes. His return empty-handed to the hotel. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Tomorrow night, he said. Tomorrow night, Clara agreed. After he slipped back to his room, Clara lay in the dark and listened to the building. The managed silence was not quite complete. There were sounds beneath it or within it, like frequencies operating just below the range of easy hearing. Footsteps in corridors she could identify no source for. A sound from somewhere in the walls that might have been voices or might have been nothing. And once, unmistakably, something that resolved for just a moment into the shape of a human cry, before it was swallowed by the thickness of the building around her. She did not sleep. The morning brought no shift in the atmosphere. Clara descended to breakfast with the performance of a woman who had slept well and was simply a curious guest with an interest in horticulture, and found it one of the more demanding performances of her life. The dining room contained the same occupants as the previous evening, plus a middle-aged businessman who sat behind his newspaper with the concentrated focus of a man who was trying very hard not to be noticed or approached. After breakfast, Clara made her inquiry about the hotel grounds. Adelaide's response was smooth as river stone. The outbuildings are old and potentially dangerous, dear. We wouldn't want anyone hurt. The grounds are restricted for guest safety. She noted the keys at Adelaide's waist as she said this. 7 keys on a ring that she carried in the manner of someone for whom the weight of them had become unconscious habit. More keys than the guest rooms required. More keys than any legitimate hotel operation would need on the body of a single person. Daniel, meanwhile, had persuaded Josiah into conversation about the hotel's history, navigating the man's pride in his establishment against the sharp edges of his suspicion of the press. "25 years is remarkable," Daniel said. "You must have built an extraordinary reputation among regular travelers." "Our reputation," Josiah said, "is for absolute discretion. Our guests come here knowing they will not be discussed, observed, or troubled. What happens at the Blackwood stays within these walls." He laughed at his own phrasing, and the laugh was entirely wrong, the kind of laughter that fills a space where genuine warmth should be but is not. When Daniel pressed toward the topic of staff and local employment, Josiah's bonhomie contracted visibly. "We keep our operations tight. Fewer people involved, the better we maintain our standards." He excused himself shortly after, retreating to his office behind the front desk and applying 3 separate keys to the lock. Daniel climbed to the 3rd floor under the pretext of seeking a quiet space to write. The corridor was dim and narrow, most doors locked, a smell of disuse in the air that did not quite fit with a running hotel. He was moving slowly past room 307 when he heard it clearly enough that there was no possibility of misinterpretation. "Please, someone, please help me." The voice was male, hoarse, stripped down to something essential. Daniel's hand was on the door handle before the voice had finished, finding it locked as he had expected. He knocked twice softly. He identified himself as a guest. The voice inside fell to silence so sudden and complete that it communicated a specific kind of terror, the terror of someone who has tried before to attract attention and learned that attracting attention makes things worse. Daniel was cataloging the corridor layout, the door number, the distance from the staircase, the additional locks that this door shared with the one beneath the main staircase, when Josiah's footsteps arrived from below. The man's face when he reached the landing communicated, beneath the thin veneer of hostility, something that Daniel read as the face of a person who is afraid of having been caught. "The 3rd floor is reserved for long-term residents who value their privacy," Josiah said. "Guests are not permitted." He escorted Daniel downstairs with the firm guidance of a man accustomed to physical insistence, dressed in the language of courtesy. Daniel allowed himself to be guided and committed every detail to memory. That afternoon, in the library, browsing books whose inscriptions burned in Clara's mind like accusation, they pooled their knowledge. "The books belonged to people who had been guests here," Clara said quietly. "Edmund Carver, Catherine Mills. These names are in Daniel's research files. These people did not lend their books to the Blackwood Hotel library. They left them here because they were never given the opportunity to take them back." Behind the heavy chair in the corner, Clara showed Daniel the marks on the wall. 23 marks scratched with what appeared to be a nail or a belt buckle, careful rows, counting days. The kind of marks made by someone who needed to hold on to time when everything else had been taken from them. They looked at the marks for a long moment. "Someone was held in this room," Clara said. "Someone who wanted to keep track of time," Daniel said, "and then they stopped." They could not afford to linger. Adelaide appeared in the doorway with the timing of someone who had been just outside it. Lunch would be served shortly. She hoped they were finding the library comfortable. Her gaze moved across the room in a single practiced sweep, cataloging, calculating, landing for just a fraction of a second on Clara's face before settling into the neutral warmth of professional hospitality. Clara watched her leave and thought about the marks on the wall and the syringe cases she had glimpsed through the door of a supply closet that had been left fractionally open near the staircase. The kind of syringes used in medical applications, or in other applications where a human being needed to be made manageable. That evening, the thing that changed everything was a piece of paper no larger than a playing card, folded 3 times, pressed into Clara's hand by Michael when he delivered extra blankets to her room. His movements were precise and rehearsed, the movements of someone who had planned this action many times and was now executing it for the only time he would allow himself to try. She unfolded it after his footsteps had faded completely. The handwriting was uncertain, the letters formed with the care of someone for whom writing was not natural or practiced, but the message was entirely clear. "Don't eat the food they give special. It's drugged, basement bad, barn worse. Run while you can, they kill who know too much. M." If you have stayed with us this far, you already understand that what is coming in this section of our story is not easy. The next part of the Blackwood Hotel's history contains information that, in 1892, would have been nearly incomprehensible to the American public, not because human trafficking was unknown. It was not unknown. The nightmare of chattel slavery had ended legally only 27 years before these events, and its mechanisms, its language, its financial logic had not simply dissolved when the law changed. They had gone underground, they had become invisible, they had put on new clothes, and in a remote Pennsylvania hotel on a fog-covered road, they had been refined into something efficient, systematic, and entirely hidden from view. If you are listening to this story and finding it valuable, please subscribe to the Hollow Century channel and hit the notification bell. The history we cover here is the history that the mainstream forgets, the stories that fell through the cracks of the official record. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, your subscription is the most important thing you can do to help us keep telling them. Now we go back to Clara Whitmore in room 203, holding a folded piece of paper and understanding for the first time the full shape of what she had walked into. She went to the wardrobe, she opened the hidden panel, she took her candle. The passage in the walls of the Blackwood Hotel was more extensive than she had imagined from her initial exploration of the portion accessible from her room. Following it by candlelight, crouching through the narrow corridors of rough timber, she found that it accessed virtually every room on the second floor and connected through a vertical shaft to similar passages on the first and third floors. The peepholes were everywhere, dozens of them, some positioned at heights suggesting they had been used by people seated or crouching, others at standing height. The level of surveillance this infrastructure represented was total. Nothing that happened in any room of this hotel was private. More than the surveillance, what the passages communicated was intention. Buildings are built to reflect the purposes of the people who build them. A home built for a family looks different from a warehouse. A church looks different from a factory. The Blackwood Hotel had been built for a purpose that required watching human beings without their knowledge, controlling access to every space, maintaining the appearance of normalcy on the surface while operating something entirely different in the interior. This was not a hotel that had become corrupted. This was a machine that had been designed corrupt from the first stone of its foundation. The narrow stairway descending through the walls led her down through the building's interior structure and deposited her, through a 4-foot door, into a basement she had not known existed. She extinguished her candle before opening the door, which was the right instinct, and stood for nearly a minute in absolute darkness before risking relighting it. The basement was large. She could sense its dimensions before she could see them by the change in echo, the drop in temperature, and the intensification of the chemical smell that she had first detected in the lobby, and which she now understood, smelling it at full strength, was the smell of pharmaceutical compounds. Specifically, the smell of the class of drugs used in the 1890s to manage pain, induce unconsciousness, and suppress the will and capacity of a human being to resist. The light of her shielded candle revealed a space divided by heavy curtains into several sections. The first section contained a long wooden table covered with medical equipment, syringes in various sizes arranged in rows, scalpels and clamps that had no diagnostic purpose, bottles and vials labeled in the careful script of someone with pharmaceutical knowledge, chloral hydrate, morphine sulfate, laudanum, and several compounds she did not recognize but whose quantities were significant. This was not a medicine cabinet. This was a supply operation. The amounts present could have kept dozens of people sedated across many months. Behind the first curtain, Clara found the luggage. Stacked in careful rows, labeled with tags in Adelaide Blackwood's precise handwriting, were trunks and cases and leather bags representing the personal effects of the people who had come to stay at the Blackwood Hotel and had never left. Each bag contained the life of a person reduced to its portable elements: clothing, personal papers, identification documents, the small objects that people carry with them because they expect to need them later. Clara opened a leather trunk and found men's clothing of good quality, a pocket watch with an engraving on the back, and a wallet containing the papers of a man named Edmund Carver, whose name she had seen inscribed inside the books in the library upstairs. She worked through the luggage systematically, her hands shaking, her mind cataloguing each name with the dispassionate efficiency of a person who cannot afford to feel what they are feeling until the work is done. Catherine Mills, James Howell, Robert Tarrant. 7 names, 7 lives compacted into 7 collections of abandoned belongings. And then at the far end of the row, a leather satchel with the initials TWW embossed on the side in gold lettering that had worn down to a shadow. Thomas William Whitmore. She had saved up to give him that satchel for his 21st birthday. She held it for a long time in the dark basement of a building she was increasingly certain neither she nor Daniel was going to leave through the front door. And she did not cry because there was not time, and because she needed every part of herself that was still functional, and because her brother had not left yet. His things were here. Thomas was somewhere else, somewhere that could still be reached. She put the satchel down gently, as though it was still attached to him. She moved toward the final section of the basement. The iron-banded door was heavy and set into the far wall with the deliberateness of something built to last indefinitely. Through the gap where it stood slightly ajar she could hear water moving, the trickle of an underground stream or drainage, and smell the cold, heavy smell of turned earth. A tunnel, leading somewhere outside the hotel's footprint. She was moving toward it when the sound of footsteps on the stairs above froze her entirely. She extinguished the candle and moved without light into the deepest shadow behind the stacked luggage, pressing herself into the corner and making herself small in the way that living things make themselves small when something larger and more dangerous enters their space. Josiah Blackwood descended the stairs with a lantern and the expression of a man performing a routine he found unremarkable. He was humming something tuneless and quiet. He crossed to the medical table and selected a syringe with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this action many hundreds of times. He held it up to the lantern light, checked the measure, adjusted it slightly, and expressed a small quantity with the competent efficiency of a person with genuine pharmaceutical knowledge. Almost time for the late feeding, he said to himself, with the contentment of a man who is on schedule and finds this satisfying. Can't have the product growing too agitated, bad for business. The word he used was product. Not guests, not people. Not workers, not captives, not anything that attached a human quality to the people behind the iron door and wherever that tunnel led. Product. The language of inventory management applied to human beings as naturally and casually as if he were discussing a shipment of dry goods. He continued speaking in the low, private way of someone rehearsing logistics to themselves, and the things he said in those 2 minutes in the basement of the Blackwood Hotel, while Clara Whitmore pressed herself into the darkness behind a stack of abandoned luggage represent, in her later written account of these events, the moment at which she fully understood what she was inside. Mr. Harrison arrives Thursday with the payment. The Chicago route is most profitable this quarter. Travelers going west, minimal family connections, ideal inventory for the labor operations. The mining contracts specifically have been requesting younger men with physical capability. He picked up his lantern and moved through the iron door, pulling it partially closed behind him. Clara did not move until his light had been gone for 5 full minutes. Then she went back through the hidden passages, back through the wall of the Blackwood Hotel, back into her room, and relighted her lamp with hands that took 3 attempts to strike the match successfully. The hotel was not simply a location where people were imprisoned and held. It was a collection point, a processing facility. People arrived as travelers and were converted into merchandise, drugged, stripped of their identifying possessions, moved through the tunnel in the basement to the windowless outbuilding, held there in conditions she had not yet seen but about which Michael's note had been explicit, and then sold. Sold to mining operations, factory owners, industrial concerns in Chicago and New York and elsewhere, men of wealth and standing who needed workers who could not leave, could not complain, could not organize, could not be found by the families who were looking for them. 25 years. The Blackwood Hotel had been operating in this manner for 25 years. She sat with that number for a long moment, then she went to the door and let Daniel in. The records from the office under the staircase, which Daniel had accessed through the main hidden passage while Clara was in the basement, were extensive and methodical. Adelaide Blackwood had the instincts of an accountant. Every transaction was documented. Names, dates of acquisition, brief physical descriptions, health notes, sale prices, buyer names and affiliations, and delivery notations. The ledgers dated back to 1867, the year the hotel opened. The earliest entries were modest. 1 or 2 acquisitions per year sold to agricultural operations and domestic service arrangements, but the operation had grown steadily as the network of buyers expanded and the Blackwoods refined their methods. By the late 1880s, the hotel was processing 10 to 15 people per year. The buyers had become more varied and in several cases more disturbing. Some simply needed workers for physical labor. Others, listed only by coded designations in the ledger, were buyers whose purposes were not specified, but whose payments were significantly higher than the labor operations. 214 names across 25 years. 214 complete human lives that had walked into this building and been converted into entries in a ledger. Thomas Whitmore was listed on page 47 of the 3rd volume. Sold July 22, 1892. Buyer Marcus Holloway, Copper Mountain Mining Company, Montana Territory. Price $80. A note in Adelaide's handwriting. Healthy, cooperative, good physical condition. $80 for her brother's entire existence. They were still discussing what to do with this information when Adelaide opened Clara's door with the particular quality of someone who has not knocked, because they do not believe the room belongs to the person currently occupying it. Her eyes found the documents immediately, the corner of a ledger page protruding from under the bed's edge, the look on Clara's face. Daniel standing in a room where he had no legitimate reason to be at 5 in the morning. The performance ended with the abruptness of a lamp going out. Josiah, Adelaide called, and her voice was a different instrument than it had been during every interaction before this moment. Whatever she had been performing was simply gone. What remained was cold, precise, and completely unsurprised. The 2 men who entered behind Josiah were not hotel staff in any conventional sense. They were large men with the specific physicality of people who are regularly required to apply force to other people, and they moved with the economy of professionals. Daniel fought back with the particular determination of someone who understood he was fighting for more than just himself. He landed one solid punch before being pulled off his feet by the larger of the 2 men. Clara screamed and was grabbed from behind by Adelaide, who turned out to have, beneath the silk and the silver hair and the flawless hospitality performance, the grip of someone who had been physically managing difficult situations for 25 years. "Take them to the preparation room," Adelaide said. "Accelerate the timeline. Mr. Harrison's associate can take delivery tomorrow if the price reflects the inconvenience." They were dragged down the main staircase, through the lobby whose polished floors and warm lamps now communicated nothing except the obscenity of the contrast, and down through the door under the main staircase, through the office, and into the basement proper. The preparation room was adjacent to the luggage section. It contained narrow cots with leather restraints at the wrists and ankles, attached to the cot frames with bolts that had been set into the wood rather than simply screwed. The shelves held medical supplies and the chemical compounds from the main section, and the room smelled strongly of chloral hydrate and something else underneath it, something organic and terrible. The smell of fear accumulated over many years in an enclosed space. As they were secured to the cots, Adelaide maintained a tone of professional explanation that was, in its way, more disturbing than anything else about her. "Our actual clients," she said, "are not the guests who believe themselves to be our priority. They are the industrial operations that need workers who cannot advocate for themselves, mining companies, factory owners, certain private domestic arrangements. We provide a service that the official economy cannot provide because the official economy pretends to have principles it does not in practice enforce in remote enough locations." "Where is my brother?" Clara said. Her voice was level in the way that things are level when every possible alternative to levelness has been removed. Adelaide checked her expression and found in it whatever she was looking for. Your brother was sold to a mining operation in Montana Territory 3 months ago. The work is physically demanding. Not all workers remain viable for extended periods." She said it with the same tone she might use to discuss a piece of machinery that occasionally required maintenance. Clara did not respond to this. She was looking at the ceiling and performing a kind of interior mathematics that Daniel, watching her face, recognized as the calculation of someone who is not yet finished. "He has contacts," Daniel said. "His editor, federal marshals in Philadelphia, letters." "No, you don't," Josiah said flatly. "You arrived yesterday afternoon. The mail does not collect until this afternoon. You have spoken to no one. And this hotel has been operating exactly as it currently operates for 25 years without consequence, because the people who might generate consequences are all, in various ways, interested parties." He was not incorrect about most of this. Daniel had sent no letters. The bluff had been the only available option, and it had not worked. Adelaide prepared a syringe with the efficiency of long practice, drawing the chloral hydrate to the measure she had clearly calculated in advance. "This will keep you manageable until the morning delivery," she said. "The process is quite refined at this point." The syringe was almost at Daniel's arm when the ceiling shook. Not the gentle settling creak of an old building, a crash, then voices, then unmistakably the smell of smoke. Someone had set the Blackwood Hotel on fire. The reaction was immediate and visceral. 25 years of meticulous construction, of careful maintenance, of the physical infrastructure of an operation that had processed 214 human lives was burning. Whatever Josiah and Adelaide Blackwood were, they had built this place with their hands and their planning and their sustained effort over the better part of their adult lives, and it was their primary asset, their ongoing operation, and it was on fire. Fire in an 1892 building of seasoned timber was not a slow process. The Blackwood Hotel had been built with the dense, old-growth lumber of Pennsylvania forests, dried through decades of use, running through its walls with a system of hidden passages that functioned as airways. The fire would spread fast. They both understood this immediately and viscerally in the way that people understand certain physical facts of their environment. Adelaide looked at Josiah. Josiah looked at the ceiling. "Deal with them later," he said, and his voice was stripped of everything except urgency. He was already moving. Adelaide locked the preparation room door behind them. With a key, Clara watched her pocket. The guard who remained was a large man with the specific moral complexity of someone who had signed up for a specific category of work and was discovering that the category had been expanded without his consent in the direction of burning people alive. Clara spoke to him directly, without manipulation, without dramatics, because she had no time for either, and neither did he. "If you leave us here, you are a murderer. You chose this work. You did not choose that. There is a difference, and you know there is." The man's face went through several stages in rapid succession. He freed Daniel first, then Clara, and when she was standing, he looked at her for a moment with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. "Get out," he said. "Just go. Don't be heroes." He went up the stairs without looking back. Daniel went directly to the office section of the basement. Clara went to the luggage area and took everything she could carry, not the personal effects of the victims, which belonged to them and would be evidence for the eventual investigation, but the ledgers, the transaction records, the buyer correspondence, the documentation that Adelaide had assembled with accountant's precision over 25 years, and which now represented the most comprehensive evidence of an interstate human trafficking operation in American history. They stuffed documents inside their clothing and climbed the stairs into a lobby that was beginning to fill with smoke. The dining room beyond was fully engaged, orange light painting the ceiling through the doorway, the sound of the fire a physical thing, a roar that had nothing polite about it. People were moving in all directions, the elderly couple, the businessman, other figures Clara had not previously seen, whose presence in the hotel at 5 in the morning raised questions she could not address in the moment. Through the smoke, moving with quiet, focused purpose, she saw Michael. He was helping the elderly couple toward the front entrance, one hand supporting the old woman's elbow, his face set with the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and executed it, and is now simply managing the consequences. His eyes found Clara across the burning lobby. He gave her a small, precise nod, the kind of nod that means what it means and requires nothing added to it. She nodded back. Adelaide appeared from somewhere to her left, her hair loosened, her face marked with soot, her expression no longer anything resembling hospitality. When she saw Clara and Daniel moving through the lobby with documents visible inside their coats, her voice cut through the noise. "Josiah, they're escaping." But Josiah was somewhere in the back of the burning building, organizing a futile resistance to the fire, and the fire did not care about his organizational instincts. Clara and Daniel went through the front door of the Blackwood Hotel in the company of the other guests, and into the cool October air as the roofline above them began to show the orange light of something that was not going to be contained. They crossed the porch and the lawn and reached the tree line without stopping, and only then did they turn back to look. The Blackwood Hotel burned with the enthusiasm of a building that had been doing something wrong for a long time and was now, at last, being honest about its nature. The flames moved through it with a speed that suggested they had found the hidden passages and used them. By the time the glow was visible from the main road, the roof had partially collapsed. By the time Josiah had organized enough water to attempt anything, there was nothing left to save. They watched it from the trees, 214 names and the machine that had processed them burning. Clara thought of Thomas in a mine in Montana. She thought of Edmund Carver and Catherine Mills, and all the others whose books sat in a sparse library and whose belongings sat in a methodically labeled basement, and she turned away from the fire before it was finished because there was work to do and the work required moving. The walk to Millbrook Station took 3 hours through the forest parallel to the main road, because neither of them was willing to assume that the road itself was safe. The Blackwoods had connections throughout the local area. The sheriff was, by all evidence and now by the documents inside their coats, on the Blackwood payroll. The town of Millbrook had maintained silence about this operation for 2.5 decades, which meant either that most residents were genuinely unaware, or that awareness had been managed in some fashion. They arrived at the edge of town in the morning light, scratched by branches and damp from the ground fog, to find Everett Crane waiting behind a stand of trees as though he had expected their route. Clara's hand went to Daniel's arm immediately. "The station master, he directed us to the hotel." Crane looked at them both with the expression of a man who has been practicing an apology for a very long time and has finally arrived at the moment to deliver it, and found that it is inadequate by any measure he can imagine. "I know why you're here," he said, "and I know what I've done." The story that came out in the next 10 minutes, delivered in the flat voice of a man reading from the worst document of his life, was this. Millbrook had been in an economic crisis during the year the Blackwood Hotel opened. The railroad had brought business, but not enough. The hotel brought steady money into the local economy, and the Blackwoods had been careful, deliberate, and generous in the way they distributed that money. Suppliers were paid well. Officials were compensated separately and privately. Those who asked questions found that their questions were met with specific financial responses that made the questions less urgent. For 15 years, Crane had directed travelers who seemed to fit certain parameters toward the hotel. Travelers without local connections, travelers whose disappearance would not generate immediate organized inquiry. He had developed over those 15 years a set of signals he could read in a person within minutes of their arrival on his platform. He had become very good at it. He said this without any particular self-justification. He said it the way a doctor names a disease for a patient. He had cancer, 3 months to live, possibly 4. He had decided, watching the hotel burn from his station, that he would not take his knowledge to the ground with him. He produced a sealed envelope containing 15 pages of names, every person in Millbrook who had taken money from the Blackwoods, every official who had chosen not to investigate, every merchant who had understood the nature of the hotel's business and accommodated it for the benefit of their own bottom line. A complete accounting of the town's complicity, assembled over years by a man who had needed to know he was not alone in what he was doing, that the community around him had made the same choice. The station master had arranged passage in a freight car heading east to Harrisburg and then Pittsburgh. He helped them board before the sheriff, who was already organizing a search under the Blackwoods' direction, could cover the station. The train should have been the end of their exposure. It was not. The Blackwoods had resources and connections that extended beyond Millbrook, and they had access to a telegraph. The freight car was stopped outside Harrisburg at a roadblock organized by men Josiah had reached through the same network that had moved 214 human beings from a hotel in rural Pennsylvania to labor operations across the American interior. What followed in the darkness outside Harrisburg was the kind of physical danger that cannot be prepared for intellectually. Clara and Daniel spent 40 minutes on the rooftops of moving freight cars, crossing the gaps between them above ground that disappeared into darkness, while lanterns swept below them, and Josiah Blackwood's voice promised anyone who would listen that they were dangerous fugitives and arsonists responsible for the destruction of his property. When the Blackwoods, in a final measure of desperation, attempted to place a barricade on the tracks ahead of the moving train, an act that would have potentially derailed a passenger train and killed the engineer and anyone else aboard, they made the error that finally exceeded the scope of what even corrupt local officials could manage. Attempting to derail a public carrier was a federal crime of such visibility that it could not be ignored even by people who had spent 25 years ignoring much worse. Clara and Daniel jumped from the roof of a freight car moving at approximately 20 miles per hour and landed in the grassy embankment beside the track, and were thoroughly and painfully uninjured in the essential sense that they were alive and still in possession of the documents inside their coats. They walked through the night forest for another 4 hours and arrived at dawn at the small town of Riverside, which was outside the Blackwoods network and which contained, crucially, a telegraph office. Before you hear what happened next, we want to take a moment here at Hollow Century to ask for something small from you. If this story has held your attention, if the history of the Blackwood Hotel has made you feel the way history at its most important should make you feel disturbed and engaged and unwilling to look away, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Every subscriber is a statement that forgotten history deserves to be remembered. We'll be back in a moment with the justice, or the closest thing available to it, that followed. The federal marshals arrived in Riverside on the third day after Clara and Daniel's arrival, accompanied by Daniel's editor Garrett, who had traveled from Philadelphia within hours of receiving Daniel's coded telegram. The meeting in Daniel's hotel room had the quality of a military briefing in its atmosphere and the quality of a tribunal in its substance. Marshal Morrison was a career federal officer who had, in his 20 years of service, prosecuted land fraud, mail theft, and 2 cases involving interstate labor exploitation. He had not previously encountered a case of this particular scope and systematic organization. He read through the documentation with the steady attention of a man cataloging weapons before a battle, making occasional notes, occasionally asking Clara or Daniel a specific question in the flat economical language of someone who needs facts, not narratives. When he had finished reading, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is federal jurisdiction," he said. "Interstate commerce in persons. We'll need to move before the Blackwoods relocate or destroy additional evidence." He looked at Clara directly. "The buyers listed here, some are prominent individuals." "I know," Clara said. "They will have lawyers." "I know. This will become a large and complicated case that will take years to fully resolve." "I know," Clara said for the third time, with the particular patience of a woman who has been managing the implications of an enormous injustice for 3 months and does not need them explained to her. Morrison was quiet again. Then he said good and moved on to the operational planning. The raid on Millbrook happened 5 days after Clara and Daniel left it. Federal officers, not the local sheriff, arrived with warrants for 43 people, The Blackwoods were apprehended on the road west in a carriage with a locked strongbox containing $11,000 in cash and what appeared to be contact information for buyers in 4 states. The strongbox was, under the circumstances, the most expensive self-incrimination in the history of the Commonwealth. The outbuildings were opened by federal officers accompanied by a physician. The windowless structure at the far end of the property, the one Clara had watched Josiah enter in the night, was connected to the basement by the tunnel she had identified. It contained 14 cells, each approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, constructed with a level of engineering investment that made their purpose absolutely undeniable. 8 of the cells were empty, 6 were occupied. The 6 people found in the Blackwood outbuilding in October of 1892 had been there for periods ranging from 3 weeks to 11 months. They were in poor physical condition. 3 required immediate hospitalization. All 6 had been sedated regularly with chloral hydrate. None of them, upon being told they were free, initially believed it. This detail, reported in Daniel's article and later in Clara's book, is the one that resists simple comprehension. They had to be told multiple times by multiple people over multiple hours that they were not going to be returned to the cells, that the people who had put them there were arrested, that they could leave, that they were free. And even then, some of them could not quite believe it and walked out of the building looking back over their shoulders. Marcus Holloway and the Copper Mountain Mining Company in Montana were raided by federal marshals 17 days after the initial Millbrook arrests. The telegram that reached Clara's hotel room in Riverside contained 20 words that she read standing at the window in the early morning light, while the town of Riverside was still quiet. Copper Mountain raided, 37 workers found in captivity. Thomas Whitmore located alive, recovering, traveled to Pittsburgh General Hospital immediately. Morrison. She read it until the words stopped moving. Epilogue: the NAMES on the stone. Pittsburgh General Hospital's 3rd floor smelled of carbolic acid and starched linen, and the ward where the recovered mining camp workers were being treated had the particular quiet of a place where people are recovering from things that do not have straightforward medical names. The physical injuries were documented and treated with the medical vocabulary available in 1892. The other injuries were less nameable and would prove less tractable. Thomas Whitmore had lost 40 pounds from a frame that had not had them to lose. His hands were bandaged, the fingers on his right hand having been broken in a mining accident that had received no treatment and had healed improperly. He had been underground for 4 months in conditions that, when later documented by federal investigators and medical professionals, would produce a congressional hearing and 3 separate pieces of legislation. When he saw Clara come through the ward door, something in his face changed so fundamentally that it was less an expression than a structural event. "Clara," he said. His voice had the quality of something that had been kept in a very small space for a very long time. She took his bandaged hands as carefully as she would have held something fragile, and said the only things that mattered, which were that she had never stopped, and that he was free, and that she was here, and that they were going home. The trials began 6 months after the arrests, and occupied the American legal system and the American newspaper front pages for the better part of 2 years. Adelaide and Josiah Blackwood were convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, conspiracy, and what the federal indictment described as trafficking in persons, a legal category that the Blackwood case helped establish in federal precedent. Adelaide received a sentence of life imprisonment and died in federal custody in 1909. Josiah received the same sentence and did not survive his 2nd year of imprisonment. He died of a heart condition in 1894, which his attorney characterized as the consequence of the stress of an unjust prosecution, and which the federal physician who examined him characterized as the consequence of a lifetime of excessive drinking. Everett Crane, the station master, died of cancer in December of 1892, 2 months after giving his testimony to federal investigators. His confession and the list of Millbrook residents he provided were used to prosecute 17 people in the town, including the sheriff, 2 town selectmen, and 11 business operators who had received regular payments from the Blackwood operation. Most received fines and short prison terms. Several had their businesses seized. The town of Millbrook declined with a speed that suggested it had been sustained primarily by money whose origins were now exposed, and within 5 years had been reduced to a handful of families maintaining the post office and the church. The buyers were the most complicated element of the prosecution. 17 men of significant wealth and social standing in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and elsewhere were named in the federal indictment. Several had employed lawyers who were, in the parlance of the era, well connected. Several attempted to claim ignorance of the origins of the workers they had purchased, despite correspondence in the Blackwood ledgers that used terminology about which no reasonable person could be confused. 4 of the buyers died before trial, 2 of them by their own hands. The others received sentences ranging from 18 months to 12 years, with fines that represented, in most cases, a fraction of what they had paid for the people they had purchased. Marcus Holloway of the Copper Mountain Mining Company was convicted of multiple counts, including the deaths of 3 workers who had died in the mines under his operation, and whose deaths investigators were able to document with sufficient precision to support murder charges. He was hanged in Helena, Montana, in November of 1894, in a public proceeding that generated newspaper coverage across the country. Michael, the young man who had worked at the Blackwood Hotel as a silent employee of questionable status, and who had started the fire that burned it to the ground, was never conclusively identified to federal authorities. Clara provided what she knew of him to investigators, which was not much. A young man approximately 20 years old, thin, pale, who communicated in writing with the orthography of someone with limited formal education, and the moral clarity of someone with more than enough of whatever quality it was that made a person act rather than endure. Whether he had been an employee, a captive who had gained a degree of trust over time, or something in between was never established. His subsequent whereabouts were unknown. In Clara's book about the Blackwood Hotel, published in 1895, she dedicated 3 pages to a description of Michael and what he had done and what it had cost him, and concluded with the observation that the people who act in the darkest moments of human history are rarely the people who end up in the histories. This was one attempt to correct that. The Whitmore Foundation, established with proceeds from Clara's book and subsequent speaking engagements, operated for 17 years, helping survivors of forced labor operations access medical care, legal assistance, and the particular kind of support required by people who have been subjected to systematic dehumanization and need to remember how to exist as persons rather than property. Thomas worked with the foundation from its 2nd year, initially in an administrative capacity and later as a public speaker who testified before Congress 3 times on the subject of labor trafficking and the legal gaps that had allowed operations like the Blackwood to persist. He never fully recovered the use of the fingers on his right hand. He developed a way of writing that worked around this limitation and eventually wrote his own account of the Copper Mountain Mining Company, published in 1898, which is more specific and less narratively polished than Clara's work, and is therefore in certain respects more devastating to read. Daniel Pierce won the Press Association's recognition for public service journalism in 1893 for his coverage of the Blackwood case. He continued as an investigative journalist for another 22 years and wrote, in 1910, a comprehensive history of American labor trafficking in the post-Civil War era that remains one of the foundational texts on the subject. He and Clara corresponded for the rest of their lives, and the letters between them, donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in the 1940s by Clara's niece, contain in their accumulated detail a picture of 2 people who walked into the same dark room and came out changed in the way that surviving certain things changes people, not only with damage but with a quality of attention, a refusal to look away from things that are hard to look at. 3 years after the fire, Clara returned to the site of the Blackwood Hotel. The state had cleared the ruins and seized the property, and where the building had stood there was now a grassy clearing surrounded by the same ancient oaks that had lined the road to it, and the same October fog moved through the branches in the same patterns it had moved through them in 1892. A stone marker had been placed at the center of the clearing by an organization of survivors' families who had assembled in the intervening years to mark their losses and record them. The marker listed 217 names, names recovered from the Blackwood ledgers, supplemented by the work of investigators who had spent 2 years tracing the full scope of the operation. At the bottom of the stone, in letters cut by a mason who had been asked to make them legible from a distance, an inscription. In memory of those who suffered here, may their stories ensure such evil never prospers in silence again. Clara stood at the marker for a long time. The fog was the same fog. The trees were the same trees. The road behind her ran south toward Millbrook Station and east toward the rest of the world. She thought about what Adelaide Blackwood had said in the preparation room, in the cold hours before the fire, explaining the logic of the operation with the calm of someone who had never genuinely doubted its rationality. The official economy pretends to have principles it does not, in practice, enforce in remote enough locations. Adelaide had not been wrong about the official economy. That had been, in fact, the truest thing she said during any of their interactions. The official economy of 1892 America did pretend to have principles it was not prepared to enforce in remote enough locations. The Blackwood Hotel had simply identified this gap and filled it. The enterprise had operated for 25 years, not despite the principles of the surrounding society, but in precise calibration with the distance those principles were actually prepared to travel. This was, Clara understood, the part of the Blackwood Hotel's history that was hardest to sit with, not the fact that 2 people had built a machine for destroying human lives. That was comprehensible in the way that individual evil is comprehensible, monstrous but comprehensible. The part that resisted simplification was the town of Millbrook, the 43 people who had made individual decisions to accept money and look away, the sheriff who had written to Clara that men can be forgetful about staying in touch with family, the newspaper editors who had printed their brief dismissive notices and moved on to more local concerns. Evil of the scale the Blackwood Hotel represented does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in an environment of permission. It requires not active participation from everyone around it, but something subtler, the decision made repeatedly by many people over many years, that this is not their problem, that the travelers who come and go are not their neighbors, that the rumors that occasionally surface are not their responsibility to investigate, that the money that arrives in envelopes is not connected to anything they need to understand too clearly. The station master's list of 43 names, what it documented was not 43 villains. It documented 43 ordinary people who had made ordinary human calculations about self-interest and proximity and the limits of their own responsibility, and had arrived at conclusions that collectively enabled a 25-year nightmare. Clara placed her flowers at the base of the stone. 217 names looked back at her in the October light. "We didn't save all of you," she said. Her voice was very quiet in the clearing, but we made sure the world knew what happened here, and the people who did this faced justice, not perfect justice, not enough justice, but something rather than nothing. She turned and walked back toward the road where Daniel's carriage waited, and the oaks stood over her in the fog as they had stood over every person who had walked this road before her, and the hotel was gone, and the names were in the stone, and the work ahead was still enormous. But she had not looked away. That, she had decided, was the thing you carried forward when you could not carry anything else. In 1892, in a building that looked like any other building on a road that looked like any other road, 217 human beings had been treated as inventory. Most of them had come from cities and towns where they had families and colleagues and small personal histories, and they had stepped off a train at a small rural station and walked 2 miles into the fog and been absorbed into a machine that treated their personhood as a raw material to be processed. The machine had been built by 2 people, but it had been maintained by many. It had operated for 25 years, and it might have operated for 25 more if 2 people, on the same October afternoon, had arrived at Millbrook Station and done what everyone before them had done, which was to accept the answers they were given and move on. They did not. Hollow Century exists to tell these stories, the stories that were almost lost, the stories that required someone to refuse to look away before they could become stories at all. If you have stayed with us through this account, you already understand something important about why history like this matters, not as entertainment, not as the comfortable horror of something safely in the past, but as a map of the conditions that allowed it, and a reminder that those conditions are not as remote as we would prefer to believe. Subscribe to this channel if you believe forgotten history deserves to be remembered. Share this story if it moved you. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, because we think about the person on the other side of this story, wherever they are, and we are grateful you are here. If you or someone you know has been affected by human trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline can be reached at 1-888-370-378-88. Text services are also available. These resources are confidential. The Blackwood Hotel burned to the ground on the morning of October 5, 1892. The fire started before dawn. By sunrise it was finished. In the clearing where it stood, the grass grows back every spring without any particular awareness of what preceded it. The names are still in the stone. This has been Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives.